The global map was bleeding. From the blitzed streets of London to the Pacific's coral atolls, the machinery of war demanded a fuel that traditional manpower could no longer provide. It was a moment where the domestic silence of the 1930s was shattered by the rhythmic clatter of assembly lines and the roar of radial engines. This was not just a conflict of soldiers, it was a total mobilization of humanity. For the first time in history, the line between the home front and the battlefront began to blur, and standing at the center of this seismic shift were the women who refused to be mere spectators to history. They were the trailblazers, the codebreakers, the pilots, and the spies who stepped into the void left by a generation of men headed for the trenches. In the United States, the transformation was visceral. It began with a whisper of necessity that soon grew into a roar of industrial output. Before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the idea of a woman in a cockpit or a shipyard was often met with derision or outright hostility. Yet, as the draft drained the factories and hangars of their traditional labor force, the gates swung open. We see them now through the grain of archival film. Women like Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love, visionaries who understood that a plane does not care about the gender of its pilot, only the skill of the hands on the yoke. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, became the vanguard of this new era. They weren't just flying, they were testing the limits of what society deemed possible. Imagine the heat of a Texas runway, the shimmering asphalt reflecting a sun that seemed to bake the very spirit. Here, these women climbed into the cockpits of B-26 Marauders and P-51 Mustangs, aircraft that even seasoned male pilots approached with a degree of trepidation. They ferried these behemoths across continents, towed targets for live fire practice, and flight-tested repaired bombers, often with the silent knowledge that their contribution was considered civilian and therefore expendable in the eyes of the bureaucracy. But the courage of the WASPs was only the opening movement of a much larger symphony of defiance. Across the Atlantic, the stakes were even more intimate. In the shadow of the white cliffs of Dover, the women of the Air Transport Auxiliary were navigating the treacherous, fog-choked skies of Britain without radios or ammunition, delivering the Spitfires and Hurricanes that would decide the fate of the free world. Their story is one of quiet professionalism amidst the chaos of falling bombs. They were the invisible backbone of the Allied air defense, proving every day that the sky had no glass ceiling, only the limits of one's own resolve. This was the beginning of a revolution that would not be televised, but would be etched into the very aluminum and steel of the war effort. While the roar of engines defined the struggle in the clouds, a far more silent, yet equally lethal conflict was being waged in the sequestered estates of the English countryside and the dark alleys of occupied Europe. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion hidden away in Buckinghamshire, thousands of women, many of them members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, or Wrens, were the unacknowledged architects of an intellectual victory. They were the ones who sat for grueling hours in frigid huts, operating the towering, clattering machines that crunched through the permutations of the German Enigma code. This was a war of mathematics and intuition, where a single mistranslated letter could mean the sinking of a merchant convoy or the failure of a cross-channel invasion. These women lived under a vow of silence so absolute that many took their secrets to the grave, never telling their families that they had likely shortened the war by years. Their labor was the invisible ink of history, written in the binary of early computing and the tireless dedication of minds that refused to be sidelined. But for some, the war of secrets required stepping out of the shadows of the English countryside and into the very heart of the Nazi machine. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, began recruiting women for roles that were previously unthinkable in the theater of modern combat. These were the agents of the so-called Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, chosen for their linguistic fluidity, their nerves of steel, and their uncanny ability to blend into the mundane fabric of a conquered continent. While a man of military age in occupied France would immediately draw the suspicion of the Gestapo, a woman with a wicker basket or a bicycle was often overlooked. This oversight was a fatal mistake for the Axis powers. Women like Virginia Hall, an American with a prosthetic leg whom the Germans labeled the most dangerous of all Allied spies, organized resistance cells and mapped out drop zones under the cover of darkness. Others sat in lonely attic rooms, the rhythmic tapping of their Morse code keys serving as a beacon for the liberation to come. They operated with the haunting knowledge that the average lifespan of a wireless operator in the field was measured in mere weeks. Every transmission was a gamble with the firing squad, and many carried cyanide pills as a final mercy, a grim testament to the stakes of their mission. These women were not merely supporting the front lines, they were the front lines, operating in a world where there were no uniforms to protect them if captured, only their wits. Their presence in the field shattered the lingering illusions of the era, proving that the most effective weapon in the arsenal of freedom was often a woman with a hidden radio and a heart of fire. As the war intensified, this spirit of defiance would spread from the secret cells of the resistance to the industrial heartlands of the Allied nations. Back in the industrial heartlands of the Allied nations, a quiet revolution was transforming the landscape of the modern world. As millions of men traded their tools for rifles and left for distant shores, the engines of democracy threatened to grind to a halt. The solution lay in a workforce that had, until then, been largely relegated to the domestic sphere. Across the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, women stepped out of their kitchens and into the deafening roar of the assembly line. This was not merely a temporary adjustment. It was an industrial seismic shift. The image of Rosie the Riveter became an enduring icon of this era, but the reality behind the propaganda poster was one of grueling labor, hazardous conditions, and a relentless pace that pushed the human spirit to its limits. In the shipyards of Richmond and the aircraft factories of Seattle, women who had never held a power tool were suddenly responsible for the structural integrity of the vessels and planes that would carry their sons and husbands into battle. They learned the rhythmic dance of the pneumatic rivet gun, the blinding precision of arc welding, and the complex mathematics of aeronautical engineering. In Britain, they became known as Canary Girls, a haunting nickname for those working in munitions factories. The toxic sulfur in the TNT they handled turned their skin a jaundiced yellow and their hair a startling orange, a physical manifestation of the poison they inhaled daily to ensure the front lines never ran out of shells. Despite the constant risk of accidental explosions and the long-term health consequences of chemical exposure, they worked 12-hour shifts, fueled by a singular collective purpose. This mass mobilization shattered the long-standing myth that women were physically or temperamentally too fragile for heavy industry. By 1944, women made up a staggering percentage of the workforce in critical sectors. They weren't just filling gaps, they were innovating. They streamlined production processes and proved that their precision was often superior to that of their male predecessors. For many, this was the first time they had ever held a paycheck in their own names, providing a taste of financial independence and agency that would be impossible to fully retract once the guns fell silent. However, this progress was fraught with tension. Women of color, in particular, faced a double-edged sword of opportunity and systemic discrimination, often relegated to the most dangerous and lowest-paying jobs, yet they too used this moment to stake their claim in the industrial future. As the factories churned out a staggering volume of war materiel, turning out a new B-24 bomber every hour and a Liberty ship in a matter of days, the social fabric of the world was being rewoven. The domestic sphere was no longer a cage, but a launch pad. Yet, while the industrial front proved women's physical and technical mettle, another group of trailblazers was looking toward the horizon, determined to prove that a woman's place was not just on the factory floor, but in the very cockpits of the machines they were building. The transition from the assembly line to the flight line was marked by the deafening roar of radial engines and the sharp metallic scent of high-octane fuel hanging heavy in the Texas heat. For the women who looked up from the factory floors and saw the horizon, the call to fly was an irresistible siren song. It was Jacqueline Cochran, a record-breaking aviator, and Nancy Harkness Love, a seasoned pilot, who spearheaded the movement to put women in the cockpits of military aircraft. Their vision culminated in the formation of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, a pioneer group that would shatter the glass ceiling of the clouds. At Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, these women underwent training that was every bit as rigorous as that of their male counterparts. They marched in the dust, studied meteorology and navigation until their eyes blurred, and mastered the art of flight in planes that were often temperamental and unforgiving. Because the military had not anticipated women in these roles, there were no flight suits designed for them. They flew in zoot suits, oversized men's coveralls that they cinched at the waist with belts and string. Yet, beneath the baggy canvas, beat the hearts of elite aviators. They were supervised by the watchful eye of their mascot, Fifinella, a female gremlin designed by Walt Disney himself, symbolizing both the whimsy and the danger of their profession. The missions the WASPs undertook were far from ceremonial. They were the invisible backbone of the domestic air war. They ferried every type of aircraft in the US Army Air Force's arsenal, from the nimble, predatory P-51 Mustang to the massive four-engine B-17 Flying Fortress. When the new B-29 Super Fortress was deemed too dangerous and too intimidating by some male pilots, it was Cochrane who sent two women, Dorothea Johnson and Helen Wyatt, to fly the massive bomber. They proved through sheer skill that if a woman could handle the beast, any man should be ashamed to hesitate. Perhaps their most perilous duty was towing targets for live-fire anti-aircraft practice. Flying at low altitudes, these women trailed canvas sleeves behind their planes while ground crews fired live ammunition at them to hone their aim. It was a role that required nerves of steel and a chilling acceptance of mortality. Despite the lethality of their work, the WASPs were classified as civil service employees rather than military personnel. They paid for their own uniforms, their own room and board, and if a WASP was killed in the line of duty, as 38 of them were, the government provided no military honors, no gold star for the family, and no funds to send the body home. Her sisters in flight would often chip in their meager wages to buy a coffin and escort their fallen comrade back to her grieving parents. This lack of recognition did nothing to dampen their resolve. They flew because the country needed them, and because the sky offered a freedom that the earth still denied. Yet, as these women conquered the heavens, another silent army was mobilizing in the shadows of the intelligence world, where the weapons were not engines and lead, but logic and linguistics. Deep within the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire, a Victorian estate known as Bletchley Park became the epicenter of a hidden war. Here, the hum of machinery replaced the roar of aircraft engines. By the height of the conflict, nearly 10,000 people worked at this top-secret facility, and staggering statistics revealed that nearly 75% of them were women. They were recruited from universities, debutante balls, and the Women's Royal Naval Service, often selected for their proficiency in mathematics, linguistics, or even their skill at solving complex crosswords. They arrived under a shroud of absolute silence, signing the Official Secrets Act, a vow that bound them to a lifetime of discretion, punishable by imprisonment or worse if broken. These women were the backbone of Ultra, the Allied intelligence project that sought to crack the seemingly unbreakable German Enigma code. While history often spotlights the genius of figures like Alan Turing, the daily, grueling labor of decryption was carried out by the Bletchley girls. They operated the massive, clattering bomb machines, turning dials and checking thousands of permutations to find the settings that would unlock the enemy's secrets. In the cramped, tobacco smoke-filled huts, they worked in rotating shifts, 24 hours a day. The work was tedious and physically exhausting, demanding an intense level of concentration where a single misplaced character could mean the difference between life and death for a merchant convoy in the North Atlantic. Across the ocean, in the United States, a parallel effort was unfolding at Arlington Hall and the Naval Communications Annex. Thousands of young American women, many of them former school teachers or college students, were recruited into the Code Girls. They tackled the complex Japanese naval codes such as JN-25, meticulously documenting patterns and symbols on vast sheets of graph paper. These women were not merely clerks. They were cryptanalysts who possessed an uncanny ability to see order within chaos. Their breakthroughs provided the critical intelligence that allowed Admiral Nimitz to ambush the Japanese fleet at Midway, a turning point that shifted the entire tide of the Pacific War. The weight of their responsibility was immense. They often read the decrypted messages of enemy movements before the commanders in the field, knowing that a successful intercept meant thousands of lives saved, while a missed connection could lead to catastrophe. Yet, when the war ended, there were no parades for the codebreakers. They were told to go home, to forget what they had seen, and to never speak of their contributions. Many took these secrets to their graves, their families never knowing that the quiet woman in the kitchen had once been a vital architect of the Allied victory. Their collective brilliance shortened the war by an estimated 2 years, proving that the most powerful weapon in the global arsenal was not a bomb, but the human mind. Yet, while some fought with logic behind closed doors, others took the ultimate risk, stepping out of the shadows and directly into the heart of occupied territory. Across the English Channel, the silence of the night was frequently broken by the low hum of a Lysander aircraft flying low and fast to evade German radar. From these planes, women stepped into the void, descending by parachute into the dark forests of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They were the operatives of the Special Operations Executive and the Office of Strategic Services, recruited for their linguistic skills, their nerves of steel, and their ability to blend into a crowd. In the eyes of the Allied high commands, a woman was often the perfect weapon, because she was the last person the enemy expected to be a soldier. For these women, the war was not fought from the safety of a desk or a factory floor, but in the terrifying intimacy of occupied cities where a single slip of the tongue or a lingering glance from a Gestapo officer could mean a death sentence. Among them was Virginia Hall, an American with a prosthetic leg she nicknamed Cuthbert. Despite her physical handicap, she became one of the most effective spies in the world, organizing resistance cells, mapping drop zones, and masterminding daring prison breaks. The Germans grew so frustrated by her ability to vanish into the shadows that they labeled her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. Her story was mirrored by that of Nancy Wake, a New Zealand-born socialite who traded her life of luxury for the rugged mountains of the Auvergne. As the White Mouse, she led thousands of Maquis fighters in guerrilla warfare, proving that a woman's leadership was as lethal as any seasoned battalion commander's. The training for these missions was grueling. These women learned to kill with their bare hands, to handle plastic explosives, and to resist interrogation techniques designed to break the human spirit. They carried heavy wireless sets disguised as suitcases, constantly moving locations to stay one step ahead of the German direction-finding vans that prowled the streets. The psychological toll was immense. They lived under false identities, often unable to trust even those they worked with, knowing that the traitor was always lurking in the periphery. For those who were caught, the price was unimaginable. Noor Inayat Khan, a Sufi pacifist and talented musician, became the first female radio operator sent into occupied France. When her network was betrayed, she was captured and subjected to months of brutal questioning. Yet, she never gave up a single secret, her final word before her execution being a defiant cry of liberty. These women were the front line of a secret war, proving that courage had no gender. Their actions ensured that when the Allied armies finally landed on the beaches of Normandy, they were met by a resistance movement that was organized, armed, and ready to strike from within. Yet, as the liberation of Europe began, another group of women was moving toward the sound of the guns, prepared to face the carnage of the battlefield not with weapons, but with bandages and blood. The call for nurses was not merely a request for medical assistance. It was a desperate plea for survival in a conflict of unprecedented scale. By the end of the war, more than 59,000 women had served in the Army Nurse Corps and another 11,000 in the Navy. These women were not stationed in the safety of the rear. They were often within range of enemy artillery, working in field hospitals where the air was thick with the smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood. They lived in the same mud as the infantry, endured the same tropical fevers, and faced the same constant threat of bombardment. For many, the transition from civilian life to the front lines was a jarring plunge into the visceral reality of industrial warfare. In the Mediterranean and European theatres, nurses landed on the beaches of Anzio and Normandy shortly after the initial waves of assault. They worked in canvas tents that shook with the vibrations of nearby heavy guns, performing complex surgeries by the flickering light of lanterns or flashlights when the power failed. Their presence was a psychological lifeline for the wounded. For a soldier lying on a blood-stained cot, the sight of a nurse was the first sign that he might actually make it home. This era also witnessed the birth of a new and perilous specialty, the flight nurse. Known as the winged angels, these women served aboard transport planes that doubled as evacuation ambulances. They flew into active combat zones to retrieve the most critically wounded, often without the protection of Red Cross markings, as the planes frequently carried ammunition and supplies on their inbound trips. Flight nurses like Reba Whittle, who was shot down and became the only American nurse held as a prisoner of war in the European theatre, exemplified a new kind of mobile, high-stakes medicine. They had to manage blood transfusions and shock in unpressurized cabins, battling turbulence and the fear of enemy interceptors, while keeping their patients stable until they reached a base hospital. In the Pacific, the story took an even darker turn. Following the fall of the Philippines, 77 Army and Navy nurses were captured by Japanese forces, the largest group of American women ever taken as prisoners of war. Known as the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, they were interred for nearly 3 years in the Santo Tomas internment camp. Despite the crushing weight of starvation, disease, and the constant threat of violence, they maintained a strict military structure and continued to provide medical care to their fellow prisoners. They used improvised tools and scavenged medicine, proving that their commitment to their oath was stronger than the walls of their prison. These women did not just witness the horrors of the front, they lived them, rewriting the definition of what it meant to be a non-combatant. Their resilience ensured that tens of thousands of men who should have died on the battlefield instead lived to see the dawn of peace. But as the war reached its fever pitch, the demand for personnel grew so great that the traditional boundaries of womanhood were not just stretched, but shattered entirely. The sky was no longer a male sanctuary. In the United States, the formation of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, marked a radical departure from domestic expectations. These were women who already knew how to fly, many of them having spent their own money on private lessons before the war even began. Led by the relentless Jacqueline Cochran and the determined Nancy Harkness Love, they weren't just looking for adventure, they were answering a desperate logistical crisis. Every man sitting in a cockpit ferrying a B-17 from a factory in California to a base in New Jersey was a man who wasn't over the English Channel or the Pacific. The WASPs stepped into the breach, taking over these vital roles with a precision that silenced many skeptics. They flew every aircraft in the Army's arsenal, from the nimble P-51 Mustang to the temperamental B-29 Superfortress, a plane so massive and intimidating that some male pilots initially balked at its controls. To prove the aircraft's safety, 2 female pilots were tasked with flying the massive bomber to demonstrate that if a woman could handle it, any man could. But this wasn't just about public relations. It was about raw mechanical skill under high-stakes pressure. They towed targets for live fire practice, with anti-aircraft gunners on the ground firing real ammunition at the sleeves trailing just feet behind their planes. They tested newly repaired aircraft, essentially acting as test pilots for machines that had just come off the assembly line or been salvaged from the brink of wreckage. 38 of these women paid the ultimate price, dying in the line of duty. Yet, the shattered boundaries of the era only went so far. Because they were classified as civil service employees rather than military personnel, the government did not provide for their burials. Their grieving families had to pool money to send their bodies home in pine crates, and the military refused to drape their coffins in the American flag. This systemic denial of their status mirrored the experience of women in other clandestine and online arenas where the risk was absolute, but the recognition was non-existent. While the WASPs conquered the skies of the home front, the Soviet Union took the integration of women to a lethal extreme. On the Eastern Front, the distinction between the front line and the home front had evaporated under the weight of the Nazi invasion. Here, women were not just ferrying planes, they were loading them with bombs. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, famously dubbed the Night Witches by the terrified German soldiers they targeted, flew antiquated plywood biplanes that were little more than crop dusters. They flew in the dead of night, cutting their engines as they approached their targets to glide in total silence, the only sound being the eerie whistling of the wind against their wire struts. They operated in sub-zero temperatures, often completing 8 or more sorties in a single night, knowing that a single tracer bullet could turn their wooden planes into a funeral pyre. These women were the first to prove that the perceived limitations of their gender were a myth, mastering the art of the kill with chilling efficiency. As the war of machines and pilots intensified, a different kind of battle was being waged in the shadows, a war of secrets and signals, where a woman's intuition and intellect would become the Allies' most guarded weapon. While the Night Witches haunted the skies of the Eastern Front, a silent army of women was assembling in the rolling hills of the English countryside, far from the reach of the Luftwaffe's bombs. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian estate shrouded in absolute secrecy, the war was being fought not with lead and steel, but with logic, mathematics, and an iron-willed persistence. By the height of the conflict, nearly 10,000 people worked at this intelligence hub, and a staggering 75% of them were women. They were recruited from the hallways of elite universities, the quiet corners of libraries, and the ranks of the Women's Royal Naval Service, known affectionately as the Wrens. Many arrived with little more than a knack for complex crossword puzzles or a degree in ancient languages, only to find themselves thrust into the epicenter of the world's most sophisticated cryptographic battle, the breaking of the German Enigma code. Inside the cramped, drafty wooden huts that littered the estate grounds, these women operated the bombs. Massive, clacking electromechanical devices that were the precursors to the modern computer. The environment was one of high-octane mental exhaustion. They worked in rotating 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, in rooms thick with the smell of hot oil and the relentless rhythmic thrumming of the machines. For many, the task appeared deceptively simple, adjusting rotors, plugging in cables, and monitoring the machines for the stop that signaled a potential breakthrough. Yet, the stakes were anything but simple. A single error in judgment or a missed signal could mean the difference between a merchant fleet reaching its destination or being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic by a U-boat wolfpack. Among this clandestine sisterhood were figures like Joan Clark, a brilliant mathematician whose mind was as sharp as any tactical commander's. Despite the prevailing prejudices of the era, which saw her initially classified as a linguist because the civil service had no category for a female cryptanalyst, Clark's work on the naval enigma was revolutionary. She worked side by side with Alan Turing, providing the mathematical breakthroughs necessary to track the movements of the German Navy. These women lived a double life. By day, they held the keys to the most guarded secrets of the Axis powers, and by night, they returned to their billets, forbidden from sharing their triumphs even with their closest family members. The intelligence distilled from these efforts, known as Ultra, gave Allied commanders an invisible edge that was perhaps the greatest advantage of the entire war. It allowed them to peer through the fog of battle, anticipating enemy movements before they even began. It is now widely accepted that the tireless, unsung efforts of the women at Bletchley Park shortened the conflict by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. But as the global tide began to turn, the need for information grew even more desperate, necessitating a transition from the abstract world of codes to the visceral, dangerous reality of the underground resistance. Beyond the silent halls of Bletchley Park, the war demanded a different kind of silence, not the quiet of a secret kept in a library, but the silence of a ghost moving through a city occupied by the enemy. In the darkest corners of Nazi-held Europe, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, began a recruitment drive that would shatter every existing glass ceiling of military intelligence. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had issued a blunt, terrifying order to set Europe ablaze, and to do so, the British government turned to an unlikely group of volunteers. Women who possessed the rare combination of linguistic fluency, nerves of steel, and the ability to disappear into a crowd. These women became the eyes and ears of the Allied cause, operating in a landscape where a single misplaced word or a nervous glance could lead to a Gestapo torture chamber. They were trained in what was colloquially known as the School for Danger, learning the arts of sabotage, Morse code, and the grim mechanics of hand-to-hand combat. While the world still largely viewed women as figures of domestic stability, these operatives were mastering the use of plastic explosives and Sten guns. One of the most legendary figures of this shadow war was Virginia Hall, an American with a wooden leg whom the Germans considered the most dangerous of all Allied spies. Despite her physical handicap, which she nicknamed Cuthbert, she eluded capture for years, organizing resistance cells and mapping drop zones for Allied supplies. The Gestapo, frustrated by her persistence, circulated posters of the limping lady, yet she continued to operate, often disguised as an elderly milkmaid or a peasant woman, her radio equipment hidden beneath a basket of vegetables. Then there was Noor Inayat Khan, a Sufi pacifist and descendant of Indian royalty who became the first female radio operator sent into occupied France. In a world of betrayal and shifting loyalties, her role was the most precarious of all. Wireless operators had a life expectancy of barely 6 weeks, as German direction-finding vans constantly patrolled the streets, sniffing out the electronic signatures of clandestine broadcasts. Noor worked alone, moving from house to house and knowing that every tap of the telegraph key was an invitation to her own capture. Her eventual execution at Dachau remains a poignant testament to the ultimate price paid by those who chose the path of the partisan. These women did not just gather intelligence. They were the logistical backbone of the French resistance. They coordinated the arrival of arms, blew up railway lines to disrupt German reinforcements, and established rat lines to smuggle downed Allied pilots back to safety. They lived in a state of perpetual high-stakes theatre where their lives depended on the perfection of their forged papers and the consistency of their cover stories. By infiltrating the very heart of the Reich's administrative machinery, they proved that gender was not a limitation, but a strategic camouflage. In the eyes of the enemy, a woman was often invisible, a misconception that these trailblazers exploited with lethal efficiency. But while the resistance fighters of Western Europe moved like ghosts through the shadows of occupied cities, on the frozen expanses of the Eastern Front, the role of women shifted from the clandestine to the catastrophically direct. In the Soviet Union, the desperation of the German invasion broke down the final barriers between the home front and the front line, leading to the mobilization of over 800,000 women into the Red Army. They were not merely nurses or clerks, they were tank commanders, machine gunners, and most famously, some of the most feared aviators and snipers in military history. Among them were the legendary members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit that the Germans came to dread with a visceral, superstitious terror. Flying outdated Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, clumsy aircraft made of little more than canvas and plywood, these women flew under the cover of total darkness. High shoes. Their tactic was as ingenious as it was terrifying. As they approached their targets, they would idle their engines, gliding silently through the night air to drop their payloads before the enemy even knew they were overhead. The only sound the German soldiers heard was the eerie whistling of the wind against the plane's wire stays, a noise they likened to the sound of broomsticks cutting through the air. This led to the moniker that would be etched into history, the Night Witches. These women flew up to 15 missions in a single night, braving sub-zero temperatures and the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire without the protection of parachutes, which they left behind to shave off every possible ounce of weight for extra bombs. While the Night Witches haunted the skies, Other women were proving their lethality on the ground with a scope and a rifle. The Soviet Union was the only nation to systematically recruit and train women as snipers, recognizing that the patience, discipline, and precision required for the role were traits found in abundance among their female volunteers. No name resonates more powerfully in this lethal discipline than Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Known as Lady Death, Pavlichenko recorded 309 confirmed kills, making her one of the most successful snipers of all time. Her journey took her from the besieged streets of Odessa and Sevastopol to the White House, where she became the first Soviet citizen received by a US president. Her presence on the world stage was a jarring reminder to the West that the traditional boundaries of gender were being permanently rewritten in the crucible of the Eastern Front. These Soviet women did not just participate in the war, they redefined the limits of human endurance and technical skill under the most brutal conditions imaginable. They faced a double-edged sword of prejudice, skepticism from their own male counterparts, and a unique, targeted brutality from the enemy if captured. Yet, their success forced a radical reconsidering of what women were capable of achieving in the heat of combat. As the tide of the war began to turn, the stories of these aviators and marksmen began to filter westward, challenging Allied nations to look at their own female populations not just as temporary industrial labor, but as a vast, untapped reservoir of strategic and tactical brilliance. This shift in perception would soon ripple across the Atlantic, where a different kind of revolution was taking place in the laboratories and code-breaking rooms of the United States and Great Britain. Deep within the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire, the manor house at Bletchley Park became the epicenter of an invisible war, one fought not with lead and steel, but with logic and mathematics. While the world's attention was often fixed on the front lines, a silent army of women was quietly dismantling the Axis communications network. By 1944, nearly 3/4 of the personnel at Bletchley were women, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, known as Wrens. They were the primary operators of the massive whirring bomb machines designed to crack the German Enigma code. The work was grueling and relentless, requiring a level of concentration that could break a person's spirit. In cavernous, unheated huts, these women sat for hours in the deafening clatter of mechanical rotors, meticulously checking thousands of settings, searching for the single needle in a haystack that would reveal the day's U-boat positions or Luftwaffe orders. They were sworn to a secrecy so absolute that many would not tell their own families about their contributions for over 30 years, carrying the weight of the ultra-secret in total silence. Across the Atlantic, a parallel effort was unfolding in the United States. At Arlington Hall, a former girls' junior college turned into a hive of cryptanalytic activity. Thousands of waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, were engaged in the monumental task of breaking the Japanese purple cipher. These women were recruited from universities and teaching colleges for their aptitude in languages and mathematics. They processed millions of intercepted messages, identifying patterns in the chaos of radio waves. Their success in decrypting Japanese diplomatic and naval codes provided the Allied command with a strategic advantage that was often the difference between victory and catastrophe, directly influencing the outcomes of pivotal battles in the Pacific theater. But the intellectual contribution of women extended beyond the decryption of messages. In the laboratories of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor to NASA, a different kind of pioneer was emerging: the human computer. Long before silicon chips and digital processors, the complex equations required to design faster wings and more efficient engines were solved by hand. Hundreds of women, including the first African-American professionals in the field, worked in units to perform the intricate ballistics calculations and wind tunnel data analysis that kept Allied planes in the air. Each calculation was a life or death matter. A misplaced decimal point could mean a structural failure in a bomber or a missed target on the battlefield. These women were the architects of the jet age, their pencils and slide rules serving as the foundation for the technological superiority that would ultimately decide the conflict. As the war reached its fever pitch, These intellectual warriors proved that the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal wasn't just industrial might, but the collective brilliance of agenda previously sidelined from the world of high-stakes science and strategy. While the intellectual warriors in the laboratories and wind tunnels were shaping the future of flight and ballistics, another group of women operated in a realm where the only certainty was the constant threat of discovery and execution. If the human computers provided the data for victory, the women of the Special Operations Executive and various resistance movements provided the eyes and ears on the ground in occupied Europe. Known colloquially as the Baker Street Irregulars, these women were recruited for their linguistic fluency, their iron nerve, and their uncanny ability to blend into the background of a continent living under the shadow of the Third Reich. For many, the transition from civilian life to the clandestine war was swift and jarring. 1 month, they might have been journalists, students, or shopkeepers. The next, they were being taught how to derail trains, how to kill silently, and how to maintain a cover story under the brutal pressure of Gestapo interrogation. These secret agents parachuted into the midnight darkness of rural France, Italy, and the Balkans, often carrying nothing more than a false identity and a heavy suitcase containing a wireless radio set. The role of the wireless operator was perhaps the most perilous of all roles assigned to women during the conflict. They were the vital lifelines between the resistance cells and the high command in London, transmitting coordinates for weapon drops and intelligence on German troop movements. However, the enemy utilized sophisticated direction-finding equipment to hunt them down. A wireless operator could rarely stay on the air for more than 20 minutes before the risk of being triangulated became a virtual death sentence. They lived a nomadic, high-stress existence, moving from attic to farmhouse, knowing that the statistical life expectancy for an operator in the field was often measured in mere weeks. Among these shadows emerged figures who became legends in the whispers of the underground. There were women who led thousands of guerrilla fighters in sabotage missions, earning nicknames from the enemy that reflected both fear and grudging respect. One was pursued as a white mouse for her ability to evade every trap. Another, despite a physical disability, navigated the treacherous Pyrenees to coordinate escape routes for downed Allied airmen. These women were not merely messengers. They were tacticians and commanders who earned the loyalty of hardened partisans. They operated in a grey zone of survival where a coded note hidden in a silk scarf or a silent signal at a village cafe carried the weight of an entire division's success. As the preparations for the invasion of Normandy reached their zenith, the work of these agents became the linchpin of the Allied strategy. They were tasked with setting Europe ablaze, systematically destroying the communication lines and rail networks the German army would need to repel the coming landing. Their courage was a solitary, quiet kind, far removed from the public accolades of the home front. It was a bravery forged in the static-filled silence of a radio transmission and the cold sweat of a midnight checkpoint. Their contribution proved that the most critical front lines of the war were often invisible, located in the hearts of those willing to disappear into the darkness to light the path for the liberation of a continent. The liberation of Europe was not a single moment of triumph, but a grueling, bloody crawl through the hedgerows of Normandy and the ruins of once great cities. Following closely behind the infantry were the women of the Army Nurse Corps, who transformed the concept of the front line. No longer confined to distant base hospitals, these women moved with the tide of battle. In the chaos following the breakthrough at St. Lo, surgical teams of nurses worked in tents that shuddered with the vibrations of nearby artillery. They operated under the dim glow of flashlights when generators failed, their boots sinking into the mud of French fields, proving that the frantic pace of modern warfare required a medical response that was just as mobile and just as daring. Among the most revolutionary roles was that of the flight nurses. These women flew into active combat zones in C-47 transport planes, which were often targets for enemy fire because the aircraft were dual purpose, carrying military supplies in before taking the wounded out. Without the protection of the Red Cross, since the planes also transported ammunition, these winged angels managed the care of critically injured men at high altitudes in unpressurized cabins. They were the first to provide life-saving interventions mid-air, a feat of medical engineering and human grit that slashed the mortality rate of the wounded. Their presence in the sky was a symbol of the shifting boundaries of what women were expected to endure and achieve. As the Allied advance pierced the heart of the Third Reich, another group of women bore witness to the war's darkest conclusions. War correspondents like Lee Miller, Margaret Bourke-White, and Martha Gellhorn defied military prohibitions to reach the front. They did not just report on the movements of generals, they captured the human cost of the conflict. When the gates of Buchenwald and Dachau were thrown open, it was often these women who stood with cameras and notebooks in hand, documenting the skeletal survivors and the industrial scale of the Holocaust. Their reports stripped away the sanitized version of the war, forcing a global audience to confront the depravity they had fought to defeat. Lee Miller's haunting photographs of the liberated camps were not merely journalism, they were an indictment of silence. These women were the eyes and ears of a world that was only beginning to grasp the magnitude of the struggle. Their work ensured that the sacrifices made in the shadows of the resistance and the heat of the battlefield would be etched into the collective memory of humanity. By the time the guns fell silent in Europe, the image of the woman as a fragile bystander had been utterly dismantled. They had been the healers in the mud, the rescuers in the clouds, and the truth-tellers in the face of horror. Yet, as the focus shifted to the Pacific and the eventual return to civilian life, a new question began to emerge. Could a society that had relied so heavily on the strength of its women ever truly return to the way things were before? As the landscape of Europe began the slow, painful process of reconstruction, the fires of the Pacific continued to rage with an intensity that tested the very limits of human endurance. Here, the role of women took on a character defined by isolation and extreme environmental hardship. The Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, those Army and Navy nurses who refused to evacuate the Philippines, became symbols of unwavering duty. Captured by Japanese forces, they endured 3 harrowing years in internment camps, battling malaria, dysentery, and starvation, while continuing to treat the sick and wounded among their fellow prisoners. Their resilience shattered the myth that women were too fragile for the rigors of captivity. When they finally returned home, they did not just bring back stories of survival, they brought proof of a grit that was indistinguishable from that of the combat infantrymen. But as the mushroom clouds over Japan signaled the definitive end of the conflict, a new struggle began on the home front. The transition from a total war economy to a peacetime society was jarring. The very institutions that had spent years recruiting women into the workforce began a systematic campaign to return them to the domestic sphere. The duration was over, and with it came the expectation that the rivet guns, the drafting tables, and the laboratory equipment would be handed back to the returning men. Across the United States and Europe, millions of women received termination notices. The cultural narrative shifted almost instantly, replacing the image of the capable female worker with the idealized suburban housewife. Yet, the clock could not be turned back. The psychological landscape of the world had been permanently altered. A generation of women had seen the world, felt the weight of professional responsibility, and earned their own wages. They had discovered that they could excel in fields previously deemed the exclusive province of men. This period of demobilization was not a return to the status quo, but rather the beginning of a long, simmering tension that would eventually erupt into the second-wave feminism of the 1960s. The daughters of the women who built the bombers were raised by mothers who knew exactly what they were capable of achieving. The story of the women of World War II is a narrative of barriers broken and identities forged in the heat of global crisis. From the Soviet snipers in the snows of the East to the WASPs in the skies of the West, and from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park to the resistance fighters in the streets of Paris, they redefined the meaning of service. They did not just fill a gap, they transformed the roles they occupied. As we look back on their sacrifice, we see more than just a contribution to a military victory. We see the blueprint for a more equitable world. Their courage was the spark that eventually lit the path toward true equality, ensuring that the history of humanity would never again be written without the voices, the strength, and the indelible spirit of those who proved that bravery knows no gender.